Settle in. What I am about to tell you is not found in any textbook approved by the Ministry of Magic. It is not the sanitized, comfortable version of history that Cornelius Fudge would have you believe. Nor is it the cheerful omission of facts that Dumbledore was so peculiarly fond of offering when the truth proved inconvenient. What I am about to tell you is the full account, the unabridged, unsanitized, deeply uncomfortable truth about the single most wretched place the wizarding world has ever conjured into existence. I speak, of course, of Azkaban. That word alone, Azkaban, carries a particular weight, even among witches and wizards who have never seen its towers, never breathed the salt-rotten air that hangs perpetually over its walls. The name produces a very specific reaction, a slight chill, a tightening of the chest, a sudden, involuntary desire to be somewhere, anywhere else. You have been told, perhaps, that Azkaban is simply a prison, that it sits upon a rock in the North Sea, that its prisoners are guarded by Dementors, and that the Ministry of Magic uses it to contain the most dangerous criminals in the wizarding world. This is accurate, in the way that saying a great white shark is simply a fish is accurate, technically correct, catastrophically incomplete. The true history of Azkaban is far older, far stranger, and far darker than anything the Ministry would ever voluntarily disclose. It begins not with British wizardry at all, but with a single, deeply disturbing individual whose name has been almost entirely erased from mainstream magical history, and whose erasure, I would argue, is itself one of the great crimes of our record-keeping. His name was Echristus. Remember it. Part 1. The island before the prison, Echristus, and the thing he built. The island upon which Azkaban sits has never been a pleasant place. Long before any wizard set foot upon it, before any stone was quarried or any enchantment laid, the rock itself seems to have possessed a quality that one might charitably call inhospitable. It rises from the North Sea like a bad thought, jagged, salt-bitten, perpetually shrouded in mist and cloud. The surrounding waters are treacherous, the currents unpredictable, the storms that batter its shores neither seasonal nor sensible, but rather constant, as though the sea itself had decided long ago that this particular outcropping of stone deserved to be punished. Muggle sailors in the medieval period gave it wide berth, not because they knew anything specific was wrong with it. They couldn't see it at all. In fact, because it was concealed beneath a Fidelius charm of extraordinary power, but because sailors develop over centuries an instinct for places the sea does not want them to visit. They felt it, the unease, the sourceless dread. The concealment was intentional. Echristus did not want to be found. What we know of Echristus comes from fragmentary records, a handful of accounts buried in restricted ministry archives, brief mentions in volumes so rarely consulted that the dust on their covers had practically fossilized, and one extraordinary piece of evidence that the ministry has never fully explained and has been notably reluctant to discuss. The island itself, and what was discovered there when the Fidelius charm finally collapsed. Echristus was, by all available evidence, an extraordinarily powerful dark wizard. Not powerful in the way that Voldemort was powerful, that particular genius for cruelty, that cold architectural intelligence applied to the destruction of others, but powerful in an older, stranger sense. He was a practitioner of magic, so obscure that classifying it presents genuine difficulty even now. The branch of the dark arts he devoted himself to was not conquest, not transformation, not even the pursuit of immortality in the way we most commonly understand it. Echristus was interested in suffering as a resource. This is a concept that requires some careful unpacking, because it is one that modern magical thinking tends to skate past with considerable haste, as though lingering near the idea might prove contagious. But it is, I'm afraid, essential to understanding everything that came after. Certain ancient magical traditions, not British, not European in their mainstream form, but older, drawing from currents of thought that predate our current magical taxonomy, entirely held that extreme human suffering produced a kind of residual magical energy, not a nice energy, not the sort of energy you'd want to bottle and sell at an apothecary, but energy nonetheless, dark, dense, almost gravitational in its properties. The theory held that this energy, concentrated in sufficient quantity in a single location, could be harvested, used, that it could power enchantments of otherwise impossible complexity, sustain magical constructions that would ordinarily collapse under their own weight. And perhaps, and this is the part that Echristus appears to have been most interested in, attract and bind certain classes of magical creature that normally existed entirely Grecian, entirely of Bellon, and contra to you beland it of bis so of better of the to go of la with what will it but how us go to the Dementors were not placed at Azkaban by the Ministry of Magic. They were not summoned there, not bred there, not conjured by any committee or department or well-meaning administrator. They were drawn there by Echristus, by the suffering he created. Let us speak plainly about what that means. He did. Echristus, hidden on his concealed island, over a period of decades that the records do not fully illuminate, lured Muggle sailors to his fortress. He used the concealment enchantments not merely to hide himself, but to create gaps, deliberate, calculated vulnerabilities in the magical mist that allowed certain ships to navigate toward the island when Echristus wished them to. He brought Muggle men to his halls. He did not kill them quickly. He did not kill them cleanly. What he did to them, the Ministry records describe only in the most oblique terms, and even those oblique terms are enough to produce a specific and unpleasant sensation in the throat. He practiced what the documents describe as sustain, magical torment of a nature designed to maximize psychic emanation. He was, in the most literal sense imaginable, farming despair, growing it deliberately, feeding it, harvesting it, using the residue to build something. The fortress at Azkaban is not simply old, it is saturated. Every stone of it, every corridor, every chamber, the very bedrock of the island beneath the foundations, is soaked through with centuries of concentrated human misery. This is not metaphor. This is not atmospheric description designed to make the place sound more forbidding than it is. The magical readings taken by Ministry investigators, when they finally gained access to the island, reportedly made experienced curse breakers physically ill. The density of trapped suffering in those walls was, by all accounts, genuinely unprecedented. And into this carefully cultivated atmosphere of despair, the Dementors came. They came because Azkaban called to them, because it was, in the most fundamental sense, their natural environment, not a location chosen arbitrarily, but a place that had been alchemically transformed into something perfectly suited to their nature. Think of it this way. If you wished to attract deep sea fish, you would not set your trap in a sunlit meadow. You would go where the conditions were right, where the darkness was absolute, where the pressure was crushing, where light had never penetrated. Echristus built Azkaban to be the North Sea equivalent of that lightless trench, a place of such profound, concentrated misery that Dementors, creatures of misery themselves, found it as natural and as irresistible as water. And there, in that fortress, feeding on the suffering Echristus created and the souls of his victims, the Dementors established themselves. They became, there is no more precise word for it, residents, permanent, self-sustaining, and eventually, after Echristus himself died, of what the records do not specify. Though I have my theories, and none of them are comforting, entirely independent. When the Fidelius charm collapsed upon his death, because the secret keeper was no longer living to maintain it, the wizarding world finally saw Azkaban for the first time. What they found there was a fortress full of Dementors, the psychic residue of decades of atrocity soaked into every surface. And this is the detail that tends to be quietly omitted. No trace whatsoever of the Muggle victims. Not bones, not personal effects, not even, the investigators noted with some discomfort, any detectable lingering memory. The Dementors had been thorough. Part 2. The Ministry's acquisition, a decision that should haunt us. The question of what the Ministry of Magic should have done with Azkaban once they found it is one of the more fascinating ethical hypotheticals in wizarding history. It is fascinating primarily because the answer seems so obvious. Destroy it, cleanse it, remove the Dementors, consecrate whatever ground could be saved, and leave the rest to the sea. And yet this is precisely and entirely what the Ministry did not do. What they did instead tells us a very great deal about institutional decision-making, about the particular psychology of bureaucracies that have been given power without equivalent wisdom, and about the deeply human, or rather, deeply magical human tendency to look at something terrible and ask not, how do we stop this, but how do we use this? The Ministry's first response to Azkaban in the late medieval period was not action but study. Investigators were sent, reports were filed, committees were formed. And here, in those early committee meetings, we begin to see the first stirrings of the argument that would eventually win. The argument that Azkaban, rather than being dismantled, could be repurposed. The wizarding prison system of the time was, not to put too fine a point on it, a mess. There was no centralized facility. Holding dangerous criminals required either house arrest which depended on having someone sufficiently powerful to maintain it. Improvised containment in existing structures, which was unreliable at best, or execution, which was both irreversible and, as the centuries progressed, increasingly unfashionable. The ministry needed somewhere to put people, and Azkaban, the committee noted in minutes that have survived in the archives, was already in the business of keeping people contained. The fact that it accomplished this containment through the sustained psychological destruction of its inhabitants was noted. It was discussed, and then it was, and I use this word with full awareness of its inadequacy, tabled. What made the decision to use Azkaban as a prison particularly remarkable in retrospect was the additional decision regarding the Dementors. The ministry did not merely choose to use the island, they chose to keep its residents. More than that, they chose to formalize the relationship, the Dementors, rather than being driven out, assuming such a thing was even possible, which was itself a question that received less rigorous examination than it perhaps deserved, were designated as the official guardians of the prison. They were given, in effect, a contract. And what were the Dementors offered in exchange for their guardianship? The prisoners, not to destroy, not immediately, not entirely, but to feed upon, to drain, to reduce, over time, to the hollow, gibbering shells that long-term Azkaban inmates invariably became. The ministry's position, stated with a breathtaking matter-of-factness in the relevant documentation, was that the Dementors' feeding would naturally incentivize them to keep prisoners alive and present, since a dead prisoner is no longer a food source. This was described with what I can only assume was intended as reassurance, as a naturally self-regulating arrangement. Take a moment to sit with that. The Ministry of Magic, the body charged with maintaining law, justice, and the welfare of the wizarding community, established a prison in which the punishment, the actual, operative punishment, beyond mere incarceration, was to have your happiness methodically consumed, your best memories made inaccessible, your capacity for hope gradually and permanently destroyed by creatures whose fundamental nature was to do precisely that, not as a side effect, not as an unfortunate consequence, as a deliberate, formalized component of the sentence. There was no upper limit on the suffering this could produce. There was no regulation governing how much of a prisoner's mind could be taken before the process was deemed to have gone too far. There was no official position on the question of whether what happened to prisoners in Azkaban over the years and decades constituted torture, a word that appears conspicuously nowhere in the ministry's documentation on the subject. And almost nobody in those early centuries objected. Almost nobody in those early centuries objected because almost nobody who mattered had ever been to Azkaban themselves. The prisoners who went there were, in the beginning, the genuinely dangerous Death Eaters, murderers, those whose crimes were of such severity that public sympathy was minimal. It is very easy to sign off on an institution you will never personally inhabit, whose methods you will never personally experience, whose victims are people you have been encouraged to think of as having forfeited their claim to humane treatment. The ministry built a machine for destroying minds. They staffed it with creatures incapable of mercy. They filled it with people they had decided deserved it. and they called this justice. Part 3. Inside the walls. The architecture of despair. Let us talk about what Azkaban actually looked like, what it felt like, what it was, physically, to be there. The fortress itself is a structure of considerable age and considerable grimness, built by Ecristus in a style that does not correspond neatly to any known architectural tradition, wizarding or muggle, which is itself suggestive. The towers are too tall, the windows are too narrow, arrows slit thin in most of the cell blocks, so that even in the middle of the day the light that enters is grey and grudging, offering just enough illumination to prevent total blindness, while denying anything that might be described as comfort. The stone is black, not the romantic black of Gothic architecture, not the imposing black of deliberate aesthetic choice, but the black of stone that has absorbed so much, so many centuries, that it no longer reflects light the way ordinary matter does. The walls sweat. This is a detail that appears in almost every first-hand account of Azkaban. From investigators to former guards to the handful of prisoners who survived long enough and retained enough of themselves to describe it afterwards. The walls of Azkaban sweat constantly, a thin film of moisture running perpetually down the interior stone, so that the inside of the fortress is always damp, always cold, always slightly slimy to the touch. The smell is extraordinary, salt and mildew, and something else, something biological and deeply unpleasant that nobody has ever quite been able to name, that seems to come from the stone itself, rather than from any identifiable source. The cells are small, not prison small, in the way that modern human rights discourse has made us accustomed to discussing, not a few feet below the recommended square footage for dignified incarceration. Small in a way that suggests the size was chosen deliberately, with an understanding of what confined spaces do to human psychology over extended periods. Small enough that pacing, that most fundamental coping mechanism of imprisoned minds, is only barely possible. Small enough that you are always aware of the walls, always aware that the walls are there, always aware that they are not going anywhere. The food in the early centuries was minimal, not absent. Remember, a dead prisoner doesn't feed dementors, but minimal, enough to prevent starvation. Served without warmth, without variation, without any of the small dignities that even the most basic human institutions usually maintain around the provision of meals. There were no meal times, per se, in the way that mark the passage of days and provide psychological anchoring to the concept of time. Food arrived when it arrived, in the dark, because it was often dark. The combination of the narrow windows, the perpetual North Sea, overcast, and the specific effect the Dementors had on light. They seemed to drink it, to dim it, to make even the brightest day in the world outside feel like a grey winter afternoon, when filtered through their proximity meant that Azkaban was, for most of its hours, simply dark, not pitch dark, not the absolute nothing of a sealed room at midnight, but dark enough that the distinction between day and night blurred quickly for newly arrived prisoners, and vanished entirely for those who had been there for any significant length of time. This is important. This is not accidental. Time is among the most powerful psychological anchors available to an imprisoned mind. The ability to say it is Tuesday morning, or it has been 3 months, or I have been here for 7 years, and I will be released in 2. This is what makes long imprisonment survivable rather than simply destructive. The loss of time, the reduction of existence to an undifferentiated, continuous present with no markers of before or after, is one of the most reliably devastating things that can happen to a human consciousness. Azkaban took your time, along with everything else, and then there were the Dementors themselves, gliding through the corridors, present at all hours, not just during inspection rounds or feeding times, but simply they're always there, in the way that cold is always there in winter, a constant ambient pressure on the psyche. Their effect on prisoners accumulated over time in a way that investigators who only visited briefly failed to fully appreciate. A single Dementor encounter, as anyone who has had the misfortune of experiencing one can attest, produces a profound and deeply unpleasant episode of remembered despair. But a single encounter ends. The warmth returns. You find a way to breathe again. In Azkaban, the encounter never ended. The Dementors did not visit, they inhabited. And what happened to prisoners over months and years of continuous exposure to that draining, consuming presence was not a series of bad moments from which recovery was possible. It was a progressive, irreversible erosion of everything that made the person who they were. Memory went first, not evenly, not all at once, but in the particular way the Dementors took things, which was to remove the warmth from memories, while leaving the structure of them. You could still remember that you had been happy, that you had loved people, that you had experienced joy, but you could no longer access the feeling of it. The memories became facts rather than experiences. Cold, gray, documented evidence of a life you could no longer feel. Then the capacity for hope. Then the capacity for imagination. Then, in the long-term cases, even the capacity for coherent thought as the mind, stripped of the emotional and imaginative resources it normally used to organize experience, began to collapse inward. What emerged after years in Azkaban was not a person. It was a remnant, a biological system that continued to perform the basic functions of life, breathing, metabolizing the inadequate food, occasionally producing sounds that the more generous observers might have classified as attempts at communication, while the actual architecture of a self was simply gone, not suppressed, not dormant, gone. This is what the ministry built. This is what they maintained. This is what they used for centuries, while writing careful documentation about prisoner intake procedures and food allocation schedules, and guard rotation policies, while the thing they had actually created ate people alive. Part 4. The Dementors themselves. What are they, really? We have talked about what the Dementors do in Azkaban. It is worth pausing here to discuss what the Dementors are, because this is a question that has received, in my view, insufficient rigorous attention, and the lack of rigorous attention has had consequences. The Ministry's official classification of Dementors places them in the category of non-being, a magical creature designation that also encompasses boggarts, poltergeists, and a handful of other entities that are understood to be fundamentally different in nature from either humans or the conventional range of magical creatures. Non-beings are distinguished by two primary characteristics. They are not born and do not reproduce in any conventional biological sense, and they cannot be killed in any conventional sense, because they were never alive in the way that term is usually meant. What this classification obscures, somewhat conveniently, is the question of what Dementors actually are in any deeper ontological sense. The most widely held view among those magical theorists who have examined the question seriously, a surprisingly small group, given the subject's relevance, is that Dementors represent something like the physical manifestation of despair itself. Not creatures that cause despair in the way that a pathogen causes disease, but entities that are constitutively made of it, condensed from it, as though despair, in sufficient concentration over sufficient time, developed a kind of autonomous existence, a will to persist and expand that is not consciousness in any rich sense, but is also not mere mechanism. This view has troubling implications that its proponents tend to glide past. If Dementors are made of despair, if they are despair given form and agency, then what Echristus did on his island was not merely attract Dementors to a place he had prepared. It was, in a real sense, create them, or at minimum, participate in their creation, contribute the raw material from which they crystallized. The suffering he generated, sustained over decades, may have been literally generative. Echristus did not just build a building where Dementors came to live. He may have built a factory that produced them. And if Dementors can be produced, if they emerge from concentrated, sustained suffering in the way that thunder emerges from lightning, then the question of what Azkaban has been manufacturing for the past several centuries becomes deeply uncomfortable. The Dementor's kiss deserves particular attention in this context, because it is both the most extreme thing the Ministry has ever authorized as a formal legal punishment and, I would argue, the most revealing window into what Dementors actually are and what they actually do. When a Dementor performs its kiss, that terrible act of pressing its lipless mouth to a victim's and inhaling what it takes is the soul. Not the mind, not the memory, not the personality, although those go to as necessary collateral. The soul, the precise magical and philosophical nature of the soul, is a topic on which I could lecture for considerably longer than our current forum allows. But for our purposes, the essential point is this: the Dementor's kiss is not killing. It is something the Ministry's own legal framework has always classified as distinct from, and in many ways worse than death. The body survives. It breathes. It can be kept alive indefinitely through physical care. But the person is gone in a way that is absolute and final, with none of the conceivably fen-certain prospects of continued existence that death, in wizarding understanding, might allow. What does the Dementor do with what it takes? This question has never, to my knowledge, been satisfactorily answered. The soul does not simply cease to exist. The magical and philosophical frameworks within which wizarding understanding operates do not support the concept of a soul simply ceasing to exist upon the Dementor's consumption of it. Something happens to it. The dominant theory, articulated by a small number of magical theorists, and regarded with varying degrees of discomfort by the broader academic community, is that the consumed soul becomes part of the Dementor, not in any meaningful sense of union or transformation, in the sense of fuel, in the sense of raw material absorbed and converted, which means that the Dementors at Azkaban, those grey, gliding horrors that have inhabited the fortress since Echristus drew them there with his centuries of deliberate atrocity, are not merely old, they are, potentially, constituted in part by everything they have ever taken, by every soul consumed in the kiss, by every fragment of human warmth and hope and happiness drained, from every prisoner in every dark, sweating cell since the first prisoner arrived. They carry it all, and they grow. Part 5. The first prisoners, and the ones who should never have been there. The early history of Azkaban's use as a prison is marked by the kind of rough justice that is most charitably described as the product of its time, and least charitably described as a system designed to concentrate power in the hands of those already holding it, while providing a mechanism to neutralize anyone who might effectively challenge them. The first formal prisoners were, by the standards of any reasonable evaluation, genuinely dangerous. Mass murderers, dark wizards, whose activities had caused widespread harm, and whose continued freedom represented a real threat. It is important to acknowledge this, because the history of Azkaban is not a simple narrative in which all prisoners were innocent and all incarcerations were unjust. Some of the people sent to that island deserved to be removed from society. Some of them, by any defensible moral calculus, deserved severe punishment. But the Ministry of Magic, once in possession of a prison that worked, in the sense that nobody escaped from it, ever, for centuries, proved quite unable to restrict its use to those cases, because that is what unlimited power does. It expands to fill the moral space available to it, and the moral space available to the Ministry of Magic. Once the decision to use Azkaban had been made, and the initial discomfort had faded, proved to be enormous. The category creep began early. Dark wizards of genuine menace gave way to dark wizards of debatable menace. Debatable dark wizards gave way to political opponents of whoever was currently running the ministry. Political opponents gave way to people who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when something went badly wrong and someone needed to be held accountable. And beneath all of these, running as a constant quiet current through the entire history, were the people who were sent to Azkaban, not because of what they had done, but because of what they were: creatures, half-bloods, Muggleborns, members of whatever group the current administration had decided was sufficiently other to justify the suspension of normal procedure. There are no comprehensive records of all who were imprisoned in Azkaban. The ministry's documentation improved over the centuries, but in the early period especially, record-keeping was not a priority, and the fates of many prisoners are simply unknown. We know that people went in. We know that the system produced, reliably and consistently, destroyed minds and early deaths from the psychological ravages of long-term Dementor exposure. We do not always know who they were, or what they had actually done, or whether any of it was deserved. This uncertainty is itself a form of violence, the deliberate, or at minimum, carelessly maintained, obscurity around who was sent to Azkaban, and on what grounds, is what allows the system to persist without serious challenge. It is very difficult to build outrage around injustice you cannot name. The case of those imprisoned following the First Wizarding War is instructive precisely because it is recent enough and well documented enough to examine in some detail, and because what it reveals about the Azkaban system is unambiguous. When Voldemort fell, in the aftermath of the night at Godric's Hollow, the Ministry moved with extraordinary speed to round up known Death Eaters and allies. This was, in principle, an entirely reasonable response. These were people who had committed documented atrocities, who had participated willingly in a campaign of murder and terror, who represented a genuine, ongoing threat to the wizarding community. Sending them to Azkaban was legally, and in many cases morally, defensible. But speed and thoroughness are poor companions in legal proceedings. And what the Ministry conducted in the weeks following Voldemort's fall were not, by any rigorous definition, trials. They were processes, hearings, formalities through which the appearance of due procedure was maintained, while the outcome was predetermined. Sirius Black did not receive a trial. This is not a matter of interpretation or disputed historical record. It is a documented fact, acknowledged eventually even by the Ministry itself. He was taken to Azkaban without a hearing, without formal charges being properly processed, without any of the protections that wizarding law theoretically guaranteed to the accused. He was sent there because everyone believed he had done what they accused him of, and because believing was enough, because Azkaban existed, and Azkaban was available. And when you have a machine like that, and you are certain someone deserves it, the question of whether the certainty is justified can be very easily deferred. 12 years. 12 years Sirius Black spent in Azkaban for a crime he did not commit. 12 years in that sweating dark, with those grey presences forever gliding past his cell, draining and consuming and reducing. 12 years of his best memories made unreachable, his warmth taken, his capacity for ordinary human happiness systematically destroyed in the way the Dementors destroyed everything. He survived it, barely, in ways that mattered, not at all by a mechanism that even the Dementors could not quite reach. The knowledge that he was innocent, not a happy thought, not a source of warmth or joy, a cold, hard, unsentimental fact. He was innocent. He knew it. They could take everything else, but that one cold fact remained. He was not unique in his innocence. He was exceptional only in his ability to endure. Part 5.5. The Children of Azkaban, those born into its shadow. Before we move forward in the chronology, I want to pause on a dimension of Azkaban's history that receives almost no attention in any official account. The children, not prisoners who were children, though that happened too, in the early history of the fortress, in ways the Ministry's records touch on only with great reluctance. I mean the children who grew up in the shadow of Azkaban, without ever setting foot inside it. The children whose parents, siblings, or other family members disappeared into the fortress and came out as something unrecognizable. The children who visited St. Mungo's and sat across from people who shared their faces and their blood and no longer knew their names. Neville Longbottom is the most visible example, but he is not singular. The families of Azkaban's inmates were subjected to their own particular version of the institution's cruelty, one that the ministry never formally acknowledged, never accounted for in its justice calculus, and never expressed any formal regret about. You may send someone to Azkaban and describe that as punishment for their crimes. But their children did not commit those crimes. Their children did not choose the particular form of ongoing grief that comes from having a living family member who is absent in every meaningful way. Their children did not elect to have the defining fact of their childhood be a fortress they had never entered, and a parent who was not there. The wizarding community's response to the families of Azkaban prisoners was, and largely remains, a kind of studied social avoidance, the taint of association, the awkward silences when the subject arose, the career implications for those whose family trees had branches that led to that island. This is not a feature of the official prison system, obviously. The ministry did not formally mandate that the children of Azkaban prisoners should be treated with suspicion or quietly excluded from certain opportunities. But institutions produce effects that extend beyond their formal boundaries, and the effect Azkaban produced on the families of those inside it was a secondary punishment that operated with perfect reliability and zero official oversight. There is something particularly revealing about this informal, community-administered secondary punishment, because it could not have operated without widespread participation. It required ordinary people, teachers, employers, neighbors, parents of other children, to make a series of individual decisions to exclude, to distance, to qualify their warmth for those who carried the Azkaban association, not maliciously in most cases, not even consciously in many, but consistently and effectively. This is how institutions persist beyond their formal boundaries, not through conspiracy or deliberate policy, but through the way they shape the values and assumptions of the communities that sustain them, until the institution's logic becomes the community's logic, until the categories the institution creates, guilty, tainted, suspect, become the categories through which ordinary social interaction is filtered. Azkaban did not just contain its prisoners. It reorganized the social world around it, creating concentric rings of consequence that reached far beyond the North Sea Island, where the stones stood. Part 6. The Dementor War and the Question of Control. For most of its history, the relationship between the Ministry of Magic and the Dementors of Azkaban was a managed tension held in rough equilibrium by a combination of formal agreement, mutual interest, and what we might most accurately describe as collective avoidance of the question of who was actually in control of the arrangement. The ministry's official position was always that the Dementors were their servants, guardians under ministry authority, creatures who had, through some never-quite-explained mechanism of diplomatic achievement, agreed to serve in exchange for the feeding rights the prison provided. In this framing, the ministry was the employer and the Dementors were the employees, and the whole arrangement was characterized by the comfortable word partnership. This was nonsense. The Dementors were not under ministry control in any meaningful sense. They were present at Azkaban because Azkaban was their home, their feeding ground, the place built specifically to attract and sustain them. They stayed because staying served them. They performed the function of keeping prisoners contained because keeping prisoners contained served them. The ministry did not command the Dementors. The ministry provided the Dementors with a consistent, reliable food source, and then described this provision as control, because the alternative, acknowledging that the most feared institution in Wizarding Britain was staffed by entities that answered to no one, and nothing, was too uncomfortable to sit with. The degree to which this fiction was maintained can be seen clearly in the events of 1996, when the Dementors en masse abandoned Azkaban and went to The Ministry's response to this event was remarkable for what it revealed. They were genuinely, profoundly surprised. Not just politically embarrassed, actually surprised. They had believed their own fiction. They had convinced themselves so thoroughly of the narrative of control that when the Dementors simply chose to go elsewhere, to align themselves with the power they judged more likely to serve their interests, the Ministry had no framework for understanding what had happened, and no contingency for what to do about it. What they did in the event was close Azkaban briefly, inadequately, and then attempt to reopen it without its primary security apparatus, and with hastily recruited and entirely unsuitable human guards. The result was predictably chaotic. The prison that had never seen a successful escape in centuries was, within months of the Dementors' departure, a fundamentally different and considerably less secure institution. Voldemort, meanwhile, had gained something the Ministry had never truly possessed: a workforce of Dementors who would go where he directed them, deploy at Hogwarts, attack strategic targets, spread a specific and carefully calibrated climate of terror throughout the Wizarding world. The Dementors did not serve Voldemort because they believed in his cause. Dementors do not believe in causes, but because he offered them what they wanted, which was the opportunity to feed widely and without the constraints the Ministry arrangement had imposed. This is the true character of the Dementor alliance with Voldemort. Not loyalty, not ideology, but opportunism of the most fundamental kind. They went where the feeding was best. They followed the darkness because the darkness was where the suffering was concentrated. And when Voldemort fell, finally, definitively, at Hogwarts, the question of what to do with the Dementors reasserted itself with considerable urgency. Kingsley Shacklebolt, as the new Minister for Magic, faced a choice that his predecessors had always declined to make. What was the long-term policy on Dementor use? Part 7. What happened after the post-war question? The Wizarding world that emerged from the Second Wizarding War was, in many ways, a community in shock. The casualties had been significant. The trauma was pervasive. The institutions that were supposed to protect people had, in the final years of Voldemort's ascendancy, become instruments of oppression. The Ministry itself had been compromised, infiltrated, turned against the population it existed to serve. In this context, the question of Azkaban was both pressing and extraordinarily difficult. Do arguments for keeping Azkaban, even in its reformed, dementory or dementor-reduced form, were not trivial. The Wizarding world still needed somewhere to put its dangerous criminals. The fortress existed. The institutional knowledge of how to run it existed. The alternatives, new facilities, new models. The genuinely difficult work of building a prison system from the ground up that was both secure and humane required resources and political will that a community still recovering from war did not obviously possess in abundance. The arguments against, on the other hand, had never been stronger. Sirius Black was gone, but his case had become the emblem of everything Azkaban represented at its worst. Not just imprisonment, but the imprisonment of the innocent, without trial, without recourse, with consequences for mind and soul that no subsequent release could undo. The use of Dementors as guards had been revealed as not merely cruel, but strategically catastrophic, a security arrangement that depended entirely on the continued willingness of uncontrollable entities to play their assigned role. Kingsley Shacklebolt's stated intention was to reform the entire system. Whether the reforms that followed were sufficient, whether they addressed the fundamental problems with Azkaban rather than merely adjusting the surface conditions, is a question that serious minds continue to debate. The Dementor question received a partial resolution, of a sort. The Dementors did return to Azkaban, but the Ministry's position on the nature of the relationship was, publicly at least, revised. No longer partners, no longer guardians. The language shifted to something more honestly uncomfortable. Tolerated presences whose continued habitation of the fortress was managed rather than directed. An acknowledgement, however oblique, that the fiction of control had never been quite what it claimed. Human guards were reinstated and increased. The conditions in the prison, the cell sizes, the food provision, the access to light and fresh air were reformed to some degree, though accounts vary on how meaningfully. The process of sending someone to Azkaban was subjected to greater procedural scrutiny, with more robust trial requirements and theoretically more stringent standards of evidence. The nature of institutions is that they are more resistant to change than the individuals who inhabit them. The Ministry reformed its language around Azkaban more thoroughly than it reformed Azkaban itself. The place remained. The Dementors remained. The stone remained, saturated with its centuries of accumulated suffering, cold and black and sweating its perpetual film of moisture down walls that had heard things over the long history of the fortress that no stone should have been made to hear. Part 8. The magical mechanics of confinement. What holds you in? Beyond the Dementors. Beyond the psychological devastation of long-term exposure to those grey presences. Azkaban maintained its perfect escape record through a combination of enchantments, so layered and so deeply embedded in the fabric of the building that disentangling their specific mechanisms is a task that no single investigator has successfully completed. What is known is that Azkaban employed, in addition to whatever basic containment charms applied to the individual cells, a broader set of enchantments operating at the level of the island itself. The surrounding sea was not merely dangerous in the natural sense. Treacherous currents, sharp rocks, the near impossibility of swimming any significant distance in North Sea temperatures, but magically hostile in ways that made even an escaped prisoner's prospects of reaching open water vanishingly small. Apparition was blocked, not just within the cell blocks, but across the entire island and a considerable radius of sea around it. The enchantments preventing apparition at Azkaban were among the most robust examples of their type ever constructed, layered and reinforced over centuries until the magical suppression had become as structurally integral to the island as the rock itself. No prisoner in the entire history of Azkaban before Sirius Black had apparated out. No prisoner had transformed. No prisoner had flown, because brooms and other flying objects were, quite simply, not available. No prisoner had used any form of magical transportation, because the enchantments preventing such use were comprehensive, deep, and very, very old. Sirius Black's escape is worth examining in this context, because it was not, in the conventional sense, an escape from the magical containment system at all. He did not break the enchantments. He did not overcome the Dementor patrols. He did not find a flaw in the wards. He walked out. More precisely, he swam out as a dog, in his animagus form, small enough and sufficiently animal in his mental state that the Dementors who fed on human emotion and human memory, and the specifically human quality of despair, could not get their usual purchase on him. The enchantments preventing human magical transportation did not apply to a medium-sized dog paddling through cold water. The Dementors who should have detected his departure and raised the alarm found nothing to detect, nothing human, nothing magical in the registered sense, just a confused and underfed dog making its way through dark water. He succeeded because he was, by the time he escaped, barely human in the relevant senses, not because his mind was gone. His mind, protected by that cold knowledge of his innocence, had survived better than almost any long-term prisoner's mind had any right to. But because 12 years of Azkaban had stripped away enough of the ordinary human presence that the systems designed to detect and contain humans simply didn't see him clearly. It is a testament to something bleak about the institution that the only way out was to become, at least temporarily, something less than what you had been. Part 9. The famous prisoners, lives consumed and sometimes returned. Any account of Azkaban's history would be incomplete without a closer examination of those whose time there has been, documented in sufficient detail to give texture to what the abstract descriptions of the place's horrors actually meant in individual human terms. Bellatrix Lestrange spent 14 years in Azkaban, following her conviction for the torture of Frank and Alice. Longbottom, a crime of such deliberate, sustained viciousness that the details remain difficult to dwell on. She went to Azkaban, not broken or remorseful, but defiant, screaming Voldemort's name and her faith in his return as they took her away. 14 years under the Dementors did not break her either, which is itself a remarkable and deeply disturbing fact. What sustained her, what the Dementors could not quite consume, was the same dark certainty that sustained Sirius Black, but inverted. Where his was innocence, hers was devotion. Where his was a cold fact that provided no warmth but could not be taken, hers was a burning, consuming loyalty to a master whose eventual return she never doubted. The Dementors could drain her of ordinary happiness, of ordinary memory, of the functional architecture of normal human experience, but they could not touch the thing at her core, because the thing at her core was not happiness. It was obsession. It was a dark, total, self-annihilating love for Voldemort that had never required warmth to sustain it in the first place. She came out of Azkaban more herself than she had any rational right to be. More herself in the worst possible sense, the years of deprivation having stripped away any residual softness or ambivalence, leaving behind only the absolute and terrifying essence of what she had always been. If anything, Azkaban had refined her, concentrated her, removed everything except the devotion. Bartimaeus Crouch Jr. presents a different and, in some ways, more disturbing case. He too was imprisoned for the Longbottom torture. He too was apparently a true believer in Voldemort at the time of his incarceration. But where Bellatrix emerged from her years at Azkaban with her devotion intact and her mind largely functional, Crouch did not emerge at all in the conventional sense. He was smuggled out by his father in an act of private mercy that created its own catastrophic consequences. What those records of his time in Azkaban reveal, pieced together from testimony and observation, is a trajectory of deterioration that followed the expected pattern: the gradual collapse, the withdrawal from functional contact, the reduction to a state that his own father, a man not notably given to sentiment, apparently found sufficiently terrible to risk his career and freedom to end it. He did not emerge triumphant from his confinement. He emerged destroyed and reconstructed, remade into something that required polyjuice and another man's stolen life to function. The Azkaban he experienced was not the refining fire it was for Bellatrix. It was consumption. And then there is the case that haunts Azkaban's history most thoroughly. The case that has come to define the institution in the public imagination more than any other. The case of the Longbottoms themselves, not as prisoners, but as the victims whose condition was described by those who saw them in St. Mungo's as in some ways resembling what long-term Azkaban produced. Neville Longbottom's parents, Frank and Alice, tortured into insanity by the Cruciatus curse, sat in a ward of St. Mungo's Hospital in a state that healers compared, carefully, gently, in the language of medical euphemism, to what prolonged Dementor exposure created. Not the same mechanism, but a recognizably similar outcome. The torture that put them there, and the system that the ministry had built to punish those who did it produced, between them, a set of outcomes so intertwined and so terrible that separating the crime from the institutional response in terms of their ultimate human cost becomes difficult. The Lestranges in Azkaban, the Longbottoms in St. Mungo's, the boy who grew up visiting his parents who didn't know him, while the people who had destroyed them sat in a prison that was slowly destroying them in turn. Nobody came out of this story intact. Part 10. The Island's Dark Legacy. What Azkaban says about all of us. I want to talk, finally, about what Azkaban means, not what it is. We have covered that in considerable detail, but what it says, what its existence and its long centuries of continuous operation reveal about the wizarding world, about the human and magical human capacity for building and sustaining cruelty while calling it justice. Because here is the truth that the ministry's careful documentation, the educational curriculum's careful omissions, and the general cultural consensus of the wizarding world all conspire to obscure. Azkaban is not an aberration. It is not a regrettable historical accident, an error of judgment made in a less enlightened time that the current generation has moved past. It is the product of deliberate choices made by intelligent people who knew exactly what they were building, who had access to the information necessary to understand what the Dementors did to those in their proximity, who understood from the very beginning that what they were creating was a machine for the systematic psychological destruction of human beings. They built it anyway. They maintained it for centuries. They improved its intake procedures and its record-keeping while leaving its fundamental character, its essential nature, as a place where people were sent to have their minds eaten entirely unchanged, panned, and the magical community broadly accepted this, not because they were evil, not because they were, as individuals, people without conscience or compassion, but because the people sent to Azkaban were, in the community's general understanding, people who deserved it, because the crimes were real and the fear was real and the desire for punishment was real, because Azkaban worked in the sense that it produced no successful escapes and cost the ministry relatively little in either resources or political capital, because the people inside it were not visible, were not available to humanize themselves or complicate the narrative, were simply gone, reduced to the category of dangerous things safely contained, requiring no further thought. There is a branch of magical philosophy, not well represented in mainstream academia, for reasons that should be obvious, that holds that Azkaban did not merely confine the worst of the wizarding world, but revealed something about the wizarding world through its very existence, that a community's prisons are its autobiography, that what you are willing to do to the people you have decided are your worst is the most honest expression of your values available. If this is true, then the wizarding world's autobiography contains chapters that its most prominent citizens would prefer not to read aloud. The Dementors at Azkaban did not come from nowhere. They were not a natural disaster visited upon an innocent institution. They were there because Christus grew them from suffering, and because the ministry chose to keep them, and because for centuries each successive generation of magical authorities looked at the arrangement and concluded that, whatever it cost those inside the prison, the arrangement was sufficiently useful to the people outside it to continue. Useful. That is the word that haunts this history. Not just, not humane. Not defensible by reference to any principle that the same authorities would apply to themselves or their families. Useful. And the usefulness was maintained by a very specific cognitive operation that anyone who has ever studied how ordinary people come to participate in or tolerate extraordinary cruelty will recognize immediately. The prisoners in Azkaban were not really people. In the operational, emotional framework of those who maintained the system, they were categories: criminals, dark wizards, threats. The holders of those categories are not required to be imagined fully, are not required to be understood as having inner lives of the same weight and texture as the imaginer's own, are not required to be protected by the same standards of decency that apply to people we have agreed to see as fully human. This is the darkest secret of Azkaban. Not the Dementors, not the architecture, not the sweating black walls or the mechanisms of psychological destruction. Those are terrible, but they are the symptoms. The disease is something quieter and more ordinary. The ease with which a community of largely decent people looked at the destruction of human minds and called it appropriate, called it justice, called it the necessary cost of keeping dangerous people away from the people who mattered. We, or all of us, vulnerable to this operation. It is not a failure exclusive to the past, not a flaw limited to earlier and more barbaric generations of magical society. It is a feature of human and magical human cognition that is available at any moment to anyone with sufficient motivation to deploy it and insufficient courage to resist. Part 11. Sleeping beneath the surface. The island that remains, the fortress stands. Whatever reforms have been implemented, whatever the current ministry position on dementor use and prisoner welfare, the island remains, and the stone remains, and the centuries of what happened inside that stone remain. Magical residue is real. This is not metaphor. Locations where extreme magical events have occurred, particularly events involving strong emotions, sustained over time in concentrated form, retain a trace, not conscious, not communicative, but present in the way that an old house retains the cold of every winter it has housed, the way a battlefield retains something in its soil that is different from ordinary earth. Azkaban retains what it was built to accumulate, the densest concentration of human suffering ever deliberately created by wizarding hands. The Dementors are still there. This is not disputed. The question of what the current ministry relationship with them actually consists of the degree to which the post-war reforms have meaningfully changed the dynamic versus the degree to which the language has changed, while that substance has not, is one that I would encourage you to approach with the same critical faculty that I have attempted to model throughout this account. The island still cannot be found by Muggle ships. The mist still sits on it. The water still runs cold and treacherous around its base. The stone still weeps its perpetual moisture. And within those walls, whatever the current conditions of incarceration, the stone remembers. The walls remember. The specific quality of darkness in those narrow windowed cells is a thing that has been built up over centuries and does not disperse, because a committee has revised the feeding schedules. This is Azkaban, not merely a place, not merely a history, but an ongoing argument that the wizarding world has been making to itself, and to anyone willing to listen, about the nature of justice and the cost of convenience, and the ease with which cruelty can be institutionalized into something that looks, from a sufficient distance, almost reasonable. Epilogue. What we carry forward. If you have followed this account to its end, spent a considerable amount of time in the company of ideas that are not comfortable. That was intentional. Comfortable ideas do not require the careful attention that uncomfortable ones do. And the history of Azkaban is not a history that can be usefully engaged with in comfort. What I would ask you to take from this account is not despair, although despair is, under the circumstances, an understandable response. I would ask you instead to take something closer to what Sirius Black took from his 12 years in that dark and sweating fortress, a cold, clear-eyed knowledge, not the warm knowledge of resolved questions and satisfying conclusions, but the harder and more durable knowledge of what the evidence actually shows, stripped of the institutional smoothing that makes the past easier to live with than it deserves to be. Echristis built something on that island that the wizarding world later claimed as its own. We have been living in the consequences of that claim for centuries. The Dementors breed in the conditions that were deliberately created for them, feed on what is deliberately provided to them, and remain in a relationship with the wizarding community's legal system that is less a partnership and more a mutual dependency that neither party has yet found the courage or the mechanism to end. The island is still there, the stone still sweats, and the question that has never been satisfactorily answered, that has been deferred and papered over and surrounded with procedural language for the better part of a millennium, remains. What do you do with a machine built to destroy human beings, when the machine is also the only one you have? Do not pretend to have the answer. I offer only the observation that every generation that has failed to ask the question seriously has been complicit, in one degree or another, in the machine's continued operation. This generation is not exempt from that accounting. Neither, for that matter, is this one. Sleep well. But before you do, one final thought, offered not as flourish, but as genuine reflection from someone who has spent more time than is, probably healthy, thinking about the relationship between knowledge and power, between institutions and the individuals they process, between the systems we inherit and the choices we make within them. The history of Azkaban is, at its deepest level, a history of what happens when a community is given more power over its members than it has wisdom to wield responsibly. The power to imprison, the power to punish, the power to remove someone from the world of ordinary human interaction and place them somewhere the ordinary rules of human decency have been suspended. These are enormous powers. They are, under some circumstances, necessary powers. No society can function without the capacity to protect itself from those who would harm it. But necessity does not sanitize method. The fact that some mechanism for removing dangerous people from the community was needed does not mean that every mechanism for doing so was acceptable. The fact that punishment is sometimes warranted does not mean that any punishment is warranted. These are distinctions that the Ministry of Magic, in its management of Azkaban over the centuries, proved consistently unable or unwilling to make. And the reason this is what I would leave you with. The reason is not that the ministry was staffed exclusively by cruel or malevolent people. Some of them, certainly, but the majority were ordinary, functioning, professional, largely well-intentioned people who filed their paperwork and attended their meetings and went home to their families and managed to live with what they had built without apparent difficulty, because what they had built was not presented to them as atrocity. It was presented as policy, as procedure, as the responsible administration of a security apparatus that kept people safe. This is the oldest, most reliable mechanism by which ordinary people participate in extraordinary cruelty. The abstraction of victims into categories, the laundering of violence through bureaucratic process, the replacement of moral reckoning with procedural compliance. If the form is filled correctly, if the hearing was technically held, if the sentence was within the legal guidelines, if In other words, the process was followed. Then the outcome is justifiable, regardless of what the outcome actually is. Azkaban was the most elaborately documented atrocity in wizarding history. Every prisoner who entered had paperwork. Every sentence was on record. Every Dementor feeding was, in the Ministry's operational logic, a sanctioned security measure. The documentation was impeccable. The suffering was real and constant, and in many cases of a severity that no formal legal framework in any remotely humane tradition would endorse. The paperwork was neat. The people were destroyed. Remember that?